It's 3 a.m. and you're walking alone down a dimly lit corridor. Your footsteps echo against cold stone walls, each sound seeming to multiply in the darkness ahead. Suddenly, you hear it. Another set of footsteps, perfectly synchronized with yours. You stop, they stop. You take a breath, convince yourself it's just an echo, and continue walking. But deep down, in that primal part of your brain that's kept humans alive for millennia, you know something is following you. This moment, this delicious terror that makes your heart race, is at the very heart of what we call horror. Did you know that horror is one of the only art forms designed specifically to make us feel bad? Yet it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. We pay money to be frightened, to have our sleep disturbed, to question every creak our house makes at night. Tonight on Midnight Deep Dive, we're exploring the fascinating, complex, and surprisingly comforting world of horror. From its ancient origins in our evolutionary psychology to its modern role as both entertainment and therapy, we'll wander through Gothic castles and Victorian gaslit streets, peek into the minds of horror's greatest creators, and discover why your brain actually craves the very thing it's designed to avoid. So settle in, close your eyes, let the soft glow of your screen be your only light, and drift peacefully as we uncover the beautiful darkness that lives within us all. In the earliest days of human consciousness, when our ancestors huddled around flickering fires in caves deep beneath the earth, they painted pictures on stone walls. Many of these ancient artworks show hunting scenes, daily life, handprints, but some show something else entirely. Creatures with too many teeth, beings with eyes where eyes shouldn't be, shadows that seem to move independently of their bodies. These weren't just artistic expressions. They were humanity's first horror stories, etched in ochre and charcoal by hands that trembled not from cold, but from the need to externalize fear. You see, fear isn't just an emotion for humans. It's a survival mechanism so fundamental that it shaped our entire species. Those early humans who jumped at shadows were the ones who survived when some of those shadows turned out to have claws. Let's drift back even further to the deep evolutionary roots of terror. Your brain, right now as you listen to this, contains structures that are millions of years old. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons, has one primary job: keep you alive by making you afraid of the right things. When your prehistoric ancestor heard rustling in the tall grass, their amygdala didn't wait to see if it was wind or a saber-toothed cat. It flooded their system with adrenaline and screamed, "Run." This is why certain fears feel so universal, so primal. The fear of the dark isn't learned. Children who have never experienced danger will still cry when the lights go out. The fear of things that scuttle and crawl, of sudden loud noises, of faces that look almost but not quite human. These terrors are written into our DNA like a survival manual passed down through countless generations. The ancient Mesopotamians understood this deeply. In their mythology, the night belonged to creatures called Gallo, demons that were neither alive nor dead, who slipped through cracks in reality to torment sleeping humans. These weren't just stories. They were ways of explaining the very real terror of sleep paralysis, of nightmares, of that feeling of being watched in the darkness. Every culture developed these explanations because every human brain experiences these same fundamental fears. But here's where it gets beautiful. Even as these early humans trembled at shadows, they began to find comfort in naming their fears. The moment you give a monster a name, a story, a set of rules, you begin to have power over it. This is why every civilization independently developed folklore traditions filled with creatures of the night. From the Wendigos of Native American lore to the Rakshasa of Hindu mythology, from Germanic kobolds to Slavic domovoi, humanity's response to the unknown has always been to create stories that make the darkness feel less empty. The ancient Greeks took this a step further, giving birth to what we might recognize as the first true horror experiences. Their tragedies weren't just sad stories. They were carefully crafted emotional journeys designed to purge audiences of their deepest fears through catharsis. When Oedipus tears out his own eyes in horror at what he's done, when Medea murders her own children in revenge, these moments of theatrical terror served a psychological purpose. They allowed people to experience the absolute worst-case scenarios of human existence in a controlled environment, leaving the theater emotionally cleansed and somehow more prepared for their own lives' smaller tragedies. Think about that for a moment. Over 2,000 years ago, the Greeks understood that we need horror. Not despite our fear, but because of it. They knew that the human psyche requires a safe space to confront its deepest anxieties, and they created art specifically to serve that need. As you lie there listening to this, notice how your own body responds to these ancient fears. When I mention eyes where eyes shouldn't be, or things that scuttle in the darkness, does some primitive part of your brain perk up, even here in your safe, warm bed? That's not weakness. That's the wisdom of millions of years of evolution, still keeping watch over you as you prepare to sleep. Fast forward to a cold, damp evening in 1764. Horace Walpole sits in his Gothic Revival mansion, Strawberry Hill House, surrounded by pointed arches and painted glass windows that cast colored shadows across his writing desk. Outside, the English countryside stretches into darkness, and inside, by the light of guttering candles, Walpole puts pen to paper and writes the words that will birth an entire genre. Manfred, Prince of Otranto, had one son and one daughter. With that simple sentence, The Castle of Otranto became the world's first Gothic novel, and horror literature as we know it began to breathe. But why then? Why did horror fiction emerge from the particular moment of 18th century England like a creature crawling from its tomb? Picture the world Walpole lived in. The Age of Enlightenment was casting its rational light into every corner of human experience. Science was explaining away mysteries, religion was becoming more philosophical than mystical, and the wild, untamed forests of medieval Europe were being cleared for orderly farmland. For the first time in human history, the darkness was losing its power, and perhaps because of this, people began to crave it. The Gothic movement wasn't just literary, it was architectural, cultural, emotional. As the ordered Georgian terraces of London spread in neat rows, people became nostalgic for the chaotic beauty of medieval ruins. They built fake Gothic castles in their gardens, complete with artificial ruins and manufactured age. This wasn't mere nostalgia. It was a psychological hunger for the sublime terror that their increasingly comfortable, predictable world was leaving behind. Imagine walking through one of these Gothic revival homes on a winter evening. Your footsteps echo on stone floors, while shadows from the fire dance across vaulted ceilings that stretch up into darkness. The windows are tall and narrow, their stained glass filtering moonlight into pools of deep red and midnight blue. Every room feels like a chapel, every hallway like a monastery corridor where monks once walked in silent contemplation of mortality. This atmosphere, this careful cultivation of beautiful melancholy, became the perfect breeding ground for horror. Gothic novels understood something profound. Terror is most effective when it's wrapped in beauty. The crumbling castle isn't just scary, it's achingly romantic. The ghostly figure isn't just threatening, it's tragic, mysterious, almost beautiful in its otherworldliness. Walpole's Castle of Otranto gave birth to a formula that would define horror for centuries. An ancient building with a dark history, a protagonist trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and supernatural events that blur the line between the psychological and the genuinely otherworldly. But more than that, it established horror as a legitimate emotional experience worth exploring in art. The Romantic movement that followed embraced this wholeheartedly. Romantic poets like Lord Byron and Samuel Taylor Coleridge didn't just write about love and nature. They dove deep into the darker aspects of human experience. Coleridge's Christabel tells of a mysterious woman who may or may not be a vampire, while Byron's own scandalous life became almost as Gothic as his poetry, complete with rumors of incest, bisexuality, and occult practices. But it was on a dark and stormy night in 1816 that Gothic horror achieved its greatest triumph. Picture this scene: Lake Geneva, shrouded in unusual darkness because of volcanic ash from Mount Tambora's eruption halfway around the world. In a villa by the lake, a group of writers, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and an 18-year-old Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley, are trapped indoors by the endless rain and premature darkness. To pass the time, Byron suggests they each write a ghost story. Most of the attempts are forgotten to history, but Mary's contribution becomes something extraordinary. In the flickering candlelight, surrounded by the sounds of rain against Gothic windows, she conceives of a young scientist who discovers the secret of life itself, and uses it to create a being that becomes his own destroyer. Frankenstein wasn't just another Gothic novel, it was horror coming of age, moving beyond haunted castles and mysterious women to explore the deepest questions of human existence. What makes us human? What do we owe our creations? What happens when science oversteps the bounds of nature? Mary Shelley took the atmospheric trappings of Gothic horror and used them to examine anxieties that feel startlingly modern. Technology run amok, the responsibility of creation, the loneliness of beings who don't fit into the world as it exists. The Gothic aesthetic that emerged from this period gave us visual language we still use today. Think of every horror movie you've ever seen: the long, shadow-filled corridors, the dramatic lighting that leaves faces half in darkness, the way doors creak open to reveal mysteries beyond. All of this comes from those candlelit evenings when writers first discovered that terror could be beautiful, that fear could be sublime, and that the darkness holds not just threats, but truths about the human condition that can't be found anywhere else. The gaslight flickers against the cobblestones of a London street, casting everything in a warm, golden glow that somehow makes the shadows seem deeper, more mysterious. It's 1887, and the fog is rolling in from the Thames, wrapping the city in a blanket that muffles sound and transforms familiar streets into a labyrinth of uncertainty. In this half-lit world between day and night, between the known and unknown, Victorian horror is about to reach its bloody, beautiful peak. The Victorian era was perfect for horror in ways its inhabitants could never have imagined. On the surface, it was a time of unprecedented progress. Gas lighting was pushing back the darkness, the railway was shrinking distances, and scientific discovery was explaining mysteries that had puzzled humanity for centuries. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization and progress lurked anxieties that were uniquely suited for horror stories. Think about the pace of change in Victorian society. A person born in 1820 would have grown up in a world lit by candles and oil lamps, where the fastest mode of transport was a horse, and where most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. By the time that same person reached old age in the 1890s, they lived in a world of electric lights, steam trains, and photographs, where Jack the Ripper's crimes could be reported simultaneously in newspapers across the globe, and where scientists were discovering invisible rays and invisible forces that could kill from a distance. Is it any wonder that this was the age when horror truly came into its own? The fog itself became a character in Victorian horror. London's infamous pea supers weren't just weather, they were transformations of reality itself. On a foggy night, the familiar became foreign. The gentleman walking towards you down the street might be your neighbor, or he might be something else entirely. Sound became muffled and directionless. Distance became impossible to judge. In the fog, London stopped being a modern city and became something primal, mysterious, dangerous. It was in this perfectly atmospheric setting that Bram Stoker unleashed Count Dracula upon the world in 1897. But Dracula wasn't just another Gothic villain. He was a walking embodiment of Victorian anxieties. Here was a foreign aristocrat with strange customs and stranger hungers, arriving in modern London by ship and train, using the very infrastructure of progress to spread his ancient evil. He could transform into animals, control the weather, and worst of all, he could turn civilized English people into creatures like himself. The vampire myth that Stoker crystallized tapped into fears that were both ancient and thoroughly modern. The fear of contamination, so relevant in an age of cholera outbreaks and mysterious new diseases. The fear of foreign influence corrupting domestic purity. The fear of sexuality unchecked by Victorian moral constraints. Dracula was aristocratic enough to move in good society, but foreign enough to be fundamentally other. He was seductive enough to attract victims willingly, but monstrous enough to destroy them utterly. But perhaps most brilliantly, Stoker made his vampire a creature caught between the ancient and modern worlds. Dracula must sleep in his native soil, follow certain ancient rules, and can be repelled by symbols of faith. Yet he also studies railway timetables, ships cargo internationally, and plans his invasion with the efficiency of a Victorian businessman. He's both utterly supernatural and disturbingly practical. Meanwhile, Robert Louis Stevenson was exploring a different kind of Victorian horror in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Published in 1886, this novella tapped into the deepest fear of the Victorian middle class, the fear that beneath their carefully maintained respectability lurked something savage and uncontrollable. Jekyll and Hyde wasn't really about transformation, it was about revelation. Hyde doesn't create evil in Jekyll, he simply allows it to exist without the constraints of Victorian social expectations. In the gaslit streets of London, a respectable doctor could literally become his own dark opposite, indulging in pleasures and violences that his civilized self would never permit. The story resonated so powerfully because every Victorian reader knew the feeling Jekyll describes. The exhausting effort of maintaining respectability, the constant suppression of natural impulses, the nagging question of what they might be capable of if social constraints were removed. In Hyde, Stevenson created the perfect metaphor for the Victorian condition. Civilization as a thin veneer over something much more primitive and honest. The Victorian era also gave birth to the spiritualist movement, and with it, a new kind of ghost story. As traditional religious certainties were being challenged by scientific discovery, people sought proof of the afterlife in seances, mediums, and supernatural encounters. The drawing rooms of respectable Victorian homes became theaters for ghost stories, where families would gather around the fire to share tales of the supernatural. These weren't the crude, violent ghosts of earlier folklore. They were refined, psychological hauntings that reflected Victorian sensibilities. The ghosts in Victorian stories often appeared to right wrongs, deliver messages, or provide comfort to the living. They were supernatural, yes, but they were also deeply moral, operating within a framework of justice and propriety that even death couldn't disrupt. The technology of the Victorian era inadvertently made these ghost stories more credible. Photography was new enough that people didn't fully understand how it worked, making spirit photography seem plausible. The telegraph allowed near-instantaneous communication across vast distances, making the idea that the dead might also communicate from far realms seem less absurd. Even the telephone, when it arrived, seemed almost supernatural in its ability to carry disembodied voices across space. Victorian horror understood something that we're still grappling with today, that progress and civilization don't eliminate our capacity for terror. They simply change its shape. The monsters of Victorian horror weren't crude beasts from the wilderness. They were sophisticated threats that could walk among civilized people undetected, corruption wearing the mask of respectability, ancient evils adapted to modern methods. As gas lighting gave way to electric illumination, and the Victorian era drew to a close, the monsters it had created proved remarkably adaptable. Dracula would eventually make the transition from London's foggy streets to Hollywood's silver screen. Jekyll and Hyde would become a psychological archetype that still appears in horror today. And the idea that horror works best when it wears a civilized mask. This insight would prove to be one of the Victorian era's most lasting contributions to the genre. The year is 1920, and in a small German film studio, shadows are being born that will haunt cinema for the next century. The cameras are hand-cranked, the sets are painted canvas and plywood, and the lighting comes from powerful arc lamps that throw harsh contrasts across everything they touch. But in this makeshift world, something magical is happening. Horror is learning to move. The cabinet of Dr. Caligari flickers to life on the screen, and audiences see something they've never experienced before. The buildings lean at impossible angles, their walls painted with stark black lines that seem to cut through reality itself. Shadows fall in directions that defy physics, and the characters move through a landscape that looks like a nightmare made tangible. This isn't just a story being told, it's a dream being projected directly into the viewer's mind. German expressionist cinema emerged from the ashes of World War I, created by a generation of filmmakers who had seen the supposed civilization of Europe tear itself apart in the trenches. These directors, F.W. Murnau, Robert Wiene, Fritz Lang, understood that horror wasn't just about monsters. It was about the fragmentation of reality itself, the sense that the world you thought you knew could reveal itself to be something far stranger and more threatening. Picture the sets of these early horror films. Instead of trying to create realistic spaces, the designers painted emotions directly onto the walls. In Caligari, the buildings themselves seem to be experiencing psychological distress, their walls bending and warping like thoughts under pressure. The shadows aren't where shadows should logically fall. They're where they need to be to create maximum unease in the viewer's mind. This visual language, the use of light and shadow to create psychological states rather than simply illuminate scenes, became the foundation for every horror film that followed. When you watch a modern horror movie and notice how the lighting seems to come from impossible sources, casting faces in dramatic half-shadow or making familiar spaces look threatening, you're seeing the direct descendants of those German expressionist techniques. But it was F.W. Murnau's 1922 masterpiece, Nosferatu, that truly showed cinema's potential for horror. Max Schreck's Count Orlok wasn't the suave, aristocratic vampire that Bram Stoker had imagined. He was something far more unsettling. Tall and gaunt, with elongated fingers that ended in claw-like nails, bald head marked with pointed ears, and eyes that seemed to burn with unholy hunger, Schreck's vampire was the stuff of pure nightmare. The film's most famous scene, Orlok's shadow creeping up a staircase while his victim waits in bed, demonstrates something unique about cinematic horror. In a book, you can describe a shadow. On stage, an actor can cast a shadow, but only cinema can make that shadow itself into a character, can make it move with purpose and menace, can let it tell a story independent of the body that casts it. This is what separated film horror from all the horror that came before. Cinema could make the impossible feel real. Through careful editing, innovative camera work, and the manipulation of light and shadow, filmmakers could create experiences that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the viewer's most primitive fears. When the film industry moved to Hollywood, it brought these expressionist techniques with it, but adapted them for American audiences who wanted their monsters more glamorous, their horror more entertaining. The Universal Studios monster cycle of the 1930s and 40s created the template for horror cinema that we still recognize today. Bela Lugosi's Dracula in 1931 was suave where Orlok had been monstrous, aristocratic where the German vampire had been alien. Lugosi understood that American audiences wanted their monsters to be seductive as well as frightening. His Dracula was dangerous not because he was obviously monstrous, but because he was appealing. The famous scene where he greets Renfield at his castle, "I am Dracula, I bid you welcome," Works because Lugosi makes the character simultaneously courtly and threatening, charming and predatory. Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster, created by the legendary makeup artist Jack Pierce, became the definitive version of Mary Shelley's creature precisely because it looked both artificial and tragically human. The flat-topped head with its visible bolts, the heavy brow, the stitched-together appearance. All of this made the monster obviously unnatural, but Karloff's performance gave it a childlike innocence that made audiences sympathize even as they feared. These universal monsters established horror archetypes that continue to influence the genre today. The vampire as seductive predator, the mad scientist whose discoveries destroy him, the monster who is more tragic than evil. These became the basic building blocks of horror cinema. But perhaps more importantly, these early horror films established the rhythm of cinematic fear. They understood that horror needs breathing space, that the most effective scares come not from constant assault on the viewer's nerves, but from the careful building of tension followed by release. They perfected the use of music to manipulate emotion. Those dramatic orchestral stings that announce the monster's presence became such a standard part of horror cinema that they eventually became parody. The technology of early cinema also created unique opportunities for horror. The hand-cranked cameras could be sped up or slowed down to create unnatural movement. Double exposure allowed ghosts to appear transparent and otherworldly. Stop-motion animation could make inanimate objects come to life. These weren't just special effects. They were ways of making the impossible feel real, of creating experiences that existed nowhere but on the silver screen. As sound came to cinema, horror gained a new dimension. Suddenly, silence became a tool. The absence of sound could be just as frightening as the presence of it. A creaking floorboard, a whispered threat, the sound of something moving just out of sight. These audio cues could direct the audience's attention and heighten their fear in ways that silent cinema could only approximate. The early sound era also established many of the audio conventions of horror cinema. The use of dissonant music to create unease, the way normal sounds, a heartbeat, breathing, footsteps, could become threatening when amplified and isolated. The power of silence to make audiences hyper-aware of every small sound in the theater. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine you're on a roller coaster, clicking slowly up to the highest point. Your rational mind knows you're safe. The ride has been inspected. The safety harness is secure. Thousands of people have ridden this same track without incident. But your body doesn't care about statistics. Your heart is racing. Your palms are sweating, and every primitive alarm system in your brain is screaming warnings about the impending fall. Then you plummet and something magical happens. The terror transforms into exhilaration. The same adrenaline that made you want to flee now makes you feel incredibly alive. You're laughing, screaming with delight, already planning to ride again. This transformation, from genuine fear to genuine pleasure, is the key to understanding why horror works and why we keep coming back for more. Neuroscientists have a name for this phenomenon: benign masochism. It's the uniquely human ability to enjoy negative emotions when we know we're actually safe. Unlike every other animal on the planet, humans can take experiences that evolution designed to be unpleasant, fear, disgust, sadness, even physical pain, and transform them into sources of pleasure when the threat isn't real. Your brain on horror is a fascinating thing to observe. When you're watching a scary movie or reading a frightening story, multiple systems are activated simultaneously. The amygdala, your brain's alarm system, responds to the perceived threat exactly as if it were real. It floods your system with stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, noradrenaline, preparing your body for fight or flight. But here's where it gets interesting. Your prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain, knows perfectly well that you're safe. You're in your bed, listening to a gentle voice tell you stories. There's no actual threat. So instead of interpreting these stress hormones as signals of danger, Your brain recontextualizes them as excitement, as engagement, as a form of controlled intensity that feels pleasurable rather than threatening. This creates a unique neurochemical cocktail. The stress hormones make you feel alert and engaged, while the knowledge of safety allows you to enjoy these sensations rather than be overwhelmed by them. When the scary moment passes, your brain releases dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in other pleasurable experiences like eating, sex, and social bonding. You get a literal reward for having successfully navigated a fake threat. But horror offers more than just neurochemical thrills. For many people, it serves as a form of emotional regulation, a way of managing anxiety and stress in their real lives. Think about it this way. Everyday anxiety is often vague and uncontrollable. You worry about work, relationships, health, the future, fears that have no clear resolution, no obvious endpoint. Horror, by contrast, gives you very specific, time-limited fears with clear resolutions. The monster appears, creates tension, and is either defeated or escapes. But either way, the story ends. You get to experience intense fear in a controlled environment where you know exactly how long it will last and can stop it whenever you want. It's like emotional exercise. You work out your fear muscles in a safe environment, so they're stronger when you need them in real life. There's also something profoundly social about horror. From those ancient humans huddling around fires telling stories about monsters, to modern audiences shrieking together in movie theaters, horror has always been a communal experience. When you're scared alongside other people, it creates a unique form of bonding. You've shared something intense together, navigated the same emotional journey, and emerged safe on the other side. This social aspect explains why horror often feels more enjoyable when experienced with others. The person next to you in the theater isn't just another audience member. They're a fellow survivor of the experience you've just shared. There's an immediate intimacy in having been frightened together, a sense that you've seen each other in a vulnerable state and made it through together. Horror also provides a socially acceptable way to explore taboo subjects and forbidden emotions. In real life, we're not supposed to think about violence, death, the breakdown of social order, our own capacity for cruelty. But horror creates a space where these thoughts and feelings can be examined safely. The monster on screen can represent aspects of ourselves that we're not allowed to acknowledge in polite society. Our anger, our selfishness, our capacity for destruction. Carl Jung would have understood this perfectly. His concept of the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we repress or deny, finds perfect expression in horror. The monsters we create in our stories aren't just external threats. They're projections of internal conflicts. Vampires represent our fear of our own predatory instincts. Zombies embody our terror of losing our individual consciousness. Demons manifest our guilt about our capacity for evil. By confronting these shadow aspects through horror, we integrate them into our conscious awareness without having to act on them in real life. It's a form of psychological processing that allows us to acknowledge the full spectrum of human nature. Light and dark, civilized and savage, creative and destructive. For some people, horror serves an even more specific function. It helps them process trauma. This might seem counterintuitive. Why would someone who's experienced real terror want to seek out fictional fear? But research suggests that controlled exposure to fear through horror can actually help trauma survivors regain a sense of agency and control. When you've experienced genuine helplessness, choosing to be scared becomes an act of empowerment. You're proving to yourself that you can handle fear, that you can experience intense emotions and still remain in control. The horror fan who says, "That didn't scare me," isn't necessarily showing off. They might be celebrating their own resilience, their ability to face down fear and emerge unshaken. There's also what researchers call the mood management theory of horror consumption. Just as you might put on a sad song when you're feeling melancholy or an upbeat playlist when you want energy, Some people use horror to regulate their emotional states. Feeling numb, horror can make you feel something intense. Feeling overwhelmed by vague anxieties, horror provides specific, manageable fears that resolve cleanly. The most dedicated horror fans often describe the experience in almost meditative terms. They talk about losing themselves in the story, about achieving a state where their everyday worries disappear, and they're completely focused on the immediate emotional experience. This is remarkably similar to what psychologists call flow state, that feeling of complete absorption in an activity that makes time seem to stop. In horror's flow state, you're not thinking about your job, your relationships, your responsibilities. You're completely present, focused entirely on the unfolding story and your emotional responses to it. It's a form of mindfulness achieved through controlled terror. Your mind becomes completely quiet except for the immediate experience of fear and its resolution. In the deepest part of your mind, in chambers that evolved long before language or logic, there live certain shapes that you've never seen but somehow recognize. A pale figure that drinks life from others, a shambling mass of the recently dead, a face that's almost human but wrong in ways that make your skin crawl. These aren't just characters from movies or books, they're archetypes, patterns of meaning that exist in what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, shared symbols that speak to fundamental human experiences. Every culture, no matter how isolated, has independently created versions of these same monsters. This isn't coincidence. It's evidence that certain fears are so fundamental to the human experience that they emerge spontaneously whenever people begin telling stories about the darkness that surrounds them. Let's begin with perhaps the most enduring of all horror archetypes, the vampire. On the surface, vampires are about blood and death, but look deeper and you'll see they represent something far more complex, the fear of being consumed by others. Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The vampire takes what you need to live and uses it to sustain itself. It's immortal while you're mortal, beautiful while you decay, powerful while you're vulnerable. But most importantly, the vampire creates more vampires. It doesn't just kill you, it transforms you into something like itself. This is the fear of losing your essential self, of being changed by others in ways you can't control or reverse. Think about how vampire myths have evolved to reflect the anxieties of different eras. In early folklore, vampires were crude, bloated creatures that rose from graves to feed on their former neighbors. Fears of disease and contamination made manifest. By the Victorian era, Dracula had become a suave aristocrat who could move through polite society while remaining fundamentally predatory, a reflection of anxieties about foreign influence and sexual corruption. Modern vampires are often portrayed as romantic figures, tragic heroes struggling with their nature. This transformation reflects our contemporary fears about intimacy and relationships. The modern vampire story asks, what if the person you love literally needs to consume you to survive? What if passion and destruction are inseparably linked? These are metaphors for very real relationship dynamics, the ways people can drain each other, the fine line between intense love and psychological consumption. The zombie represents a different but equally primal fear, the loss of individual consciousness. Zombies are you, but not you. They have your face, your body, your memories perhaps, but they lack the spark of individual awareness that makes you uniquely yourself. They're humanity without humanity, consciousness without choice. Zombie stories always focus on the same question. How long can you remain yourself when everyone around you is losing their individuality? It's a perfect metaphor for social conformity, for the ways that group pressure can erode personal identity. When zombie stories became popular in the 1960s and 70s, they reflected anxieties about mass media, consumer culture, and political manipulation, all forces that seemed to be turning individuals into mindless members of crowds. The modern zombie apocalypse narrative adds another layer, What happens when the structures of civilization collapse? Zombie stories are never really about zombies. They're about how quickly civilized people become savage when the social contract breaks down. The real monsters in zombie stories are usually the other survivors, the humans who abandon morality when survival is at stake. Then there are the ghosts, perhaps the most psychologically complex of all horror archetypes. Ghosts represent unfinished business, the past refusing to stay buried. Their guilt made manifest, trauma that won't heal, relationships that death couldn't end. Unlike vampires or zombies, ghosts don't want to consume or convert you. They want something much more disturbing. They want you to acknowledge them, to help them resolve whatever prevented them from moving on. Ghost stories are always, at their heart, about the living rather than the dead. They're about the ways that guilt, regret, and unprocessed grief can haunt us more effectively than any supernatural entity. When a ghost appears in a story, it's usually because someone among the living has failed to deal with some emotional truth. The haunting continues until that truth is acknowledged and processed. The demon archetype taps into humanity's oldest fear, the existence of pure malevolence. Unlike vampires who are driven by hunger or ghosts who seek resolution, demons represent evil for its own sake. They're the fear that somewhere in the universe exists intelligence that wants nothing more than to cause suffering. Corruption that spreads simply because corruption is its nature. Demonic possession stories explore the terror of losing control of your own body and mind. The possessed person says and does things that are completely contrary to their nature, as if their essential self has been pushed aside and something alien is operating their physical form. This reflects very real fears about mental illness, about the ways that depression, addiction, or trauma can make people feel like strangers to themselves. But perhaps the most unsettling archetype is the one that horror creators call the uncanny valley. Things that are almost human but not quite. This could be a doll that seems to watch you, a mannequin whose expression appears to change when you're not looking directly at it, or a person whose smile is just a little too wide, whose eyes don't quite track normally, whose movements are slightly off in ways you can't precisely identify. The uncanny valley effect is hardwired into our brains as a survival mechanism. Throughout human evolution, the ability to quickly distinguish between members of our own species and potential threats was literally a matter of life and death. Predators that could mimic human appearance or behavior were particularly dangerous. So our brains evolved to feel intense discomfort when something looked human but didn't quite act human. This is why clowns are so effective as horror figures. With their exaggerated features, painted smiles that don't change, and movements that seem simultaneously human and mechanical, clowns trigger our uncanny valley response. They're human enough that we expect them to act human, but artificial enough that they never quite do. The shapeshifter represents perhaps our deepest existential fear. That identity itself is fluid, that the people we trust might literally be someone or something else. These creatures can perfectly mimic human appearance and behavior, making it impossible to know who to trust. They turn social bonds into sources of terror because anyone might be the monster in disguise. Body horror, pioneered by filmmakers like David Cronenberg, explores fears about the reliability of our own physical forms. In body horror, the human body becomes a site of transformation, corruption, or rebellion against the mind that inhabits it. These stories reflect anxieties about aging, disease, medical procedures, and the ways that our bodies can betray us or change in ways beyond our control. The mad scientist archetype embodies fears about knowledge without wisdom, progress without ethics. From Dr. Frankenstein to Dr. Jekyll, these figures represent the terror of human intelligence, unchecked by moral consideration. They're warnings about the dangers of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, without considering the consequences of what that knowledge might unleash. What makes these archetypes so powerful is that they operate on multiple levels simultaneously. A vampire story can be about literal blood-sucking monsters, but it can also be about toxic relationships, sexual predation, economic exploitation, or cultural imperialism. The same story can speak to a child's fear of strangers and an adult's anxiety about corporate power structures. This is why horror archetypes are so endlessly adaptable. Each generation rediscovers them and makes them relevant to contemporary fears. The fundamental human anxieties remain the same: loss of identity, loss of control, loss of loved ones, loss of life. But the specific shape those anxieties take changes with culture and technology. But here's the beautiful thing about horror archetypes. By recognizing them, by seeing them as symbols rather than literal threats, we gain power over them. When you understand that the monster in your nightmares represents something specific about your waking life, you can begin to address the real source of the fear instead of just its symbolic manifestation. Jung believed that integrating these shadow archetypes was essential for psychological health. By acknowledging the existence of these fears, by allowing ourselves to experience them in the safe space of fiction, we prevent them from festering in the unconscious, where they can manifest in more destructive ways. The monsters in our stories aren't our enemies. They're our teachers, showing us parts of ourselves and our world that we might otherwise ignore or deny. In facing them in fiction, we become better equipped to face the real challenges they represent in our actual lives. Picture an American family in 1954, gathered around their new television, set in their suburban living room. The Cold War is in full swing, nuclear weapons tests are lighting up the desert sky, and Senator Joseph McCarthy is hunting for communist infiltrators in every corner of American society. On their TV screen, a flying saucer descends from the sky, and strange beings with advanced technology begin taking over human bodies, turning neighbors into emotionless shells of their former selves. This isn't just entertainment, it's anxiety made visible. The alien invasion films of the 1950s weren't really about extraterrestrials. They were about the fear of ideological contamination, the terror that foreign influences could turn Americans into something un-American. Whether the invaders came from outer space or from behind the Iron Curtain hardly mattered. What mattered was that they represented the fear of losing one's identity to an alien ideology. Horror has always been society's shadow, reflecting back our deepest collective anxieties in the distorting mirror of monster stories. Each era creates the monsters it needs, the fears that make sense within its particular moment of history. By examining what scares us, we can understand what we value, what we're trying to protect, and what changes in our world feel most threatening. The 1950s were perfect for alien invasion stories because they captured multiple anxieties simultaneously. The fear of nuclear annihilation. Aliens often possessed advanced, destructive technology that could wipe out humanity. The fear of communist infiltration. Pod people and body snatchers looked like normal Americans but served alien masters. The fear of conformity. Suburban life was supposed to be perfect, but what if that perfection came at the cost of individual identity? Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers worked on multiple levels. You could watch it as a warning about communist infiltration, where alien pods represented the spread of socialist ideology through American communities. Or you could read it as a critique of American conformity, where the pods represented the soul-crushing sameness of suburban life. The beauty of effective horror is that it can contain multiple meanings simultaneously, speaking to different fears within the same cultural moment. As the 1960s arrived, bringing social upheaval and generational conflict, horror evolved to match. The clean-cut alien invaders of the 50s gave way to more primal, chaotic threats. George Romero's Night of the Living Dead in 1968 wasn't just the birth of the modern zombie. It was a mirror reflecting a society that felt like it was tearing itself apart. Released in the same year as the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy during the height of the Vietnam War and urban riots, Night of the Living Dead presented an America where the dead literally rose up to devour the living. The film's shocking ending, where the black protagonist survives the zombie apocalypse only to be shot by a white posse who mistake him for one of the undead, made explicit connections between monster stories and real-world violence. The 1970s brought a different kind of horror, one that reflected the decade's loss of faith in authority and institutions. This was the era of Watergate, Vietnam, economic recession, and environmental disasters. The monsters of 70s horror weren't alien invaders or reanimated corpses. They were corrupt authority figures, dysfunctional families, and nature itself turning against humanity. The Exorcist terrified audiences not just with its supernatural elements, but with its portrayal of helpless experts. Doctors can't explain Regan's condition, priests doubt their own faith, and modern medicine proves useless against ancient evil. In a decade when people were losing faith in government, military, and religious leaders, a story about the failure of all forms of authority felt particularly resonant. The slasher films that dominated the late 70s and early 80s reflected changing attitudes towards sexuality and gender roles. Movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th established a formula where sexually active teenagers were punished by masked killers, while final girls, usually virginal, resourceful young women, survived to defeat the monster. These films emerged during a period of rapid social change regarding women's roles and sexual liberation. They can be read as conservative backlash against feminist progress, punishing sexually liberated women and celebrating traditional feminine virtues like purity and nurturing. Or they can be seen as empowering stories about women discovering their own strength and resourcefulness in the face of male violence. The 1980s brought Reagan-era anxieties about technology, corporate power, and bodily integrity. David Cronenberg's body horror films like Videodrome and The Fly explored fears about media manipulation and technological transformation of the human body. Meanwhile, films like Poltergeist suggested that suburban prosperity might be built on literally haunted ground. The Native American burial ground beneath the housing development, serving as a metaphor for America's violent history. The AIDS crisis profoundly influenced 80s horror, though often in coded ways. Vampire films took on new meaning when blood-borne pathogens became a real-world terror. The idea of contamination through intimate contact, of diseases that could remain hidden for years before manifesting, of communities devastated by invisible killers. All of these themes appeared in horror films that might not have explicitly mentioned AIDS, but were clearly influenced by its cultural impact. The 1990s saw the rise of self-aware horror, films like Scream that commented on horror conventions while still delivering scares. This reflected a generation that had grown up watching horror movies, that understood the rules and tropes but still wanted to be frightened. It was horror for an ironic age, one that was suspicious of sincerity but still craved authentic emotional experiences. The post-Menace 9/11 era brought a new kind of horror, one focused on invasion, surveillance, and the breakdown of safety. The torture porn subgenre reflected a world where enemies could be anyone, where pain could be inflicted for no comprehensible reason, where the very foundations of civilization felt fragile and temporary. Films like Saw and Hostel weren't just about gore. They were about the fear that the world had become a place where ordinary people could find themselves trapped in situations of helpless suffering. They reflected anxieties about terrorism, about government surveillance, about the ways that modern life made everyone potentially vulnerable to forces beyond their control. More recently, horror has begun grappling with climate change, social media, and economic inequality. Films like Get Out use horror tropes to explore racial tensions and cultural appropriation. Hereditary and Midsommar examine toxic family dynamics and the search for belonging in an atomized society. The Babadook uses monster metaphors to discuss depression and single motherhood. What's fascinating is how quickly horror adapts to reflect new anxieties. The pandemic era has already produced films about isolation, contamination, and social breakdown. Streaming services have created new forms of interactive horror that blur the line between viewer and participant, reflecting our increasingly digital lives. Horror doesn't just reflect societal fears, it also helps us process them. By giving abstract anxieties concrete form, horror stories allow us to confront and potentially resolve fears that might otherwise remain paralyzing. The monster that can be named, understood, and defeated, even temporarily, becomes less frightening than the shapeless dread of modern life. This is why studying horror can be so revealing about historical periods. The monsters a society creates tell you what that society most fears losing. Medieval Europeans created stories about vampires and plague demons because they feared disease and death. Victorian Englishmen wrote about Jekyll and Hyde because they feared the savage impulses beneath civilized behavior. Cold War Americans imagined alien invasions because they feared ideological conversion. What do our current monsters tell us about our contemporary fears? The answer might be found in the horror stories being created right now, in the nightmares that feel most relevant to audiences today. These stories are tomorrow's historical documents, preserving not just the entertainment preferences of our era, but its deepest anxieties and most urgent concerns. In the quiet hours before dawn in rural Japan, when the mist hangs low over rice paddies and the boundary between the visible and invisible world grows thin, there walks a figure in a white burial kimono. Her long black hair hangs over her face like a curtain, and when she turns toward you, if she turns toward you, the sight of what lies beneath that hair will drive you mad with terror. She is Yurei, a restless spirit bound to the earthly realm by powerful emotions, and she represents a uniquely Japanese understanding of what makes horror truly frightening. While Western horror often focuses on shock, violence, and supernatural threats that can be battled and defeated, Japanese horror, or J-horror as it's come to be known, operates on different principles entirely. It's about atmosphere, suggestion, and the slow accumulation of dread. The Yurei doesn't jump out at you, she appears gradually, becoming more visible as your own fear intensifies. She doesn't attack with claws or fangs. She simply exists in a way that shouldn't be possible, and that impossibility itself becomes the source of terror. This difference reflects deeper cultural attitudes toward death, memory, and the supernatural. In Japanese tradition, the dead don't simply disappear. They can linger if their emotional attachments to the living world are strong enough. Death is not an ending but a transformation, and not always a complete one. This creates a very different kind of ghost story, one where the horror comes not from malevolent spirits trying to harm the living, but from the tragic persistence of love, anger, or sorrow beyond death. Consider the classic Japanese tale of Oiwa, a woman who is poisoned by her husband and returns as an onryo, a vengeful spirit. But her revenge isn't the straightforward violence of Western horror. Instead, she appears to her husband at moments when he's trying to move on with his life, simply standing there, her face disfigured by the poison, reminding him of what he's done. The horror lies not in what she might do, but in the fact that she cannot be escaped or forgotten. This aesthetic of quiet, persistent dread influenced filmmakers like Hideo Nakata, whose Ringu, The Ring, became a global phenomenon. The film's ghost, Sadako, doesn't chase her victims through corridors or attack them with weapons. Instead, she simply appears, emerging from a television screen with slow, inevitable movement, her face hidden by her long hair. The terror comes from the certainty that she will reach you, that no amount of running or hiding will help, that some forms of death are as inescapable as time itself. Travel southwest to Mexico, and you'll encounter a completely different relationship with death and horror. The Day of the Dead celebrations transform what many cultures treat as frightening: skulls, graves, the imagery of mortality, into objects of beauty and celebration. Mexican culture doesn't deny death or try to hide from it. Instead, it embraces death as a natural part of life cycle, worthy of respect and even affection. This doesn't mean Mexican folklore lacks frightening elements, but they serve different purposes than horror in cultures that treat death as purely negative. La Llorona, the weeping woman who drowned her children and now searches eternally for them, is certainly a terrifying figure. But she's also a cautionary tale about the dangers of jealousy and desperation. And her story serves to remind listeners of the importance of protecting children and family bonds. The Mexican tradition of magical realism, where supernatural elements exist alongside everyday reality without explanation or apology, creates a different kind of horror story. In the works of writers like Laura Esquivel or filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro, monsters might be terrible, but they're not necessarily evil. They're part of a world where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural are porous, where horror and beauty can coexist in the same space. In the forests of northern Europe, Scandinavian folklore gave birth to creatures that reflect the harsh realities of life in a landscape where winter darkness lasts for months and survival depends on community cooperation. The Wendigo of Algonquian tradition, the Draugr of Norse mythology, the Huldufólk of Icelandic stories. These beings represent the dangers of isolation, cannibalism, and the breakdown of social bonds that keep communities alive through the darkest months. These northern horror traditions understand something profound about fear. It often comes not from external threats, but from the possibility that we ourselves might become monstrous. The Wendigo was once human, but became cannibalistic. The Draugr returns from the dead driven by greed and selfishness. The Huldufólk are almost human, but lack souls. These stories ask uncomfortable questions. What separates us from monsters? How much can we endure before we become something we wouldn't recognize? African folklore traditions offer yet another perspective on horror, one often focused on shapeshifters and beings that blur the boundaries between human and animal. The were-hyena stories of East Africa, the Impunjulu lightning bird of southern African tradition, the Asanbasum of West African mythology. These creatures often serve as explanations for natural phenomena and social disruptions. But they also explore themes of power, transformation, and the relationship between civilization and wildness. Many African horror traditions emphasize the importance of proper relationships with ancestors, with community, with the natural world. Horror often results from the disruption of these relationships, from failing to honor the dead, from betraying community trust, or from treating nature with disrespect. The monster is frequently not an external threat, but a consequence of moral failure, a reminder that actions have consequences that extend beyond the individual. Hindu and Buddhist traditions approach horror through the lens of karma and reincarnation, creating stories where the frightening elements often represent the consequences of actions taken in this life or previous ones. The Rakshasa of Hindu mythology, with its backwards hands and taste for human flesh, is terrifying, but also serves as a reminder that evil actions create evil consequences that must eventually be faced. These traditions often feature demons and spirits that are less purely malevolent than their Western counterparts, and more like forces of cosmic balance, ensuring that moral debts are paid and spiritual lessons are learned. The horror comes not from random evil, but from the inexorable working of cosmic justice, which can be far more frightening than simple malevolence. Indigenous horror traditions from around the world often share certain characteristics: a deep connection to specific places, an understanding of the supernatural as part of everyday reality, and stories that serve as teaching tools for survival and social cohesion. The skinwalkers of Navajo tradition, the aswang of Filipino folklore, the drop bears of Australian Aboriginal stories. These beings are tied to specific landscapes and cultural contexts in ways that make them most powerful within their original cultural setting. What's fascinating is how these different cultural approaches to horror reveal different assumptions about the nature of reality, death, and human relationships. Western horror often treats the supernatural as an intrusion into normal reality, something that shouldn't exist and must be explained or defeated. Other traditions accept the supernatural as a permanent part of reality, something to be negotiated with rather than eliminated. Similarly, Western horror often focuses on individual protagonists facing isolated threats, reflecting cultural values of individualism and self-reliance. Many other traditions feature horror that threatens entire communities, requiring collective action and shared responsibility to resolve. As globalization spreads cultural products around the world, we're seeing fascinating hybrids emerge. J-horror influenced American filmmakers like Jennifer Kent, The Babadook, and Ari Aster, Hereditary, to create more atmospheric, slow-burn horror. Meanwhile, Western horror tropes are being adapted and reinterpreted by filmmakers worldwide, creating new forms that blend traditional cultural elements with global horror languages. This cross-pollination enriches horror as an art form, but it also raises questions about cultural authenticity and appropriation. When Western filmmakers borrow imagery from other cultures' horror traditions, do they honor those traditions or exploit them? When global audiences consume horror from different cultures, what context is lost or gained in translation? Perhaps the most important lesson from examining horror across cultures is that fear itself is universal, but the specific shape that fear takes is deeply cultural. We all share basic human vulnerabilities: death, isolation, loss of identity, loss of control. But the monsters we create to embody these fears reflect our particular social structures, spiritual beliefs, and environmental challenges. There's a woman who lives alone in a small apartment in Chicago, and every night before bed, she puts on her headphones and listens to true crime podcasts about serial killers. Her friends think this is strange, even unhealthy, but for her, these stories of the darkest human behavior serve a different purpose entirely. She's a survivor of assault, and somehow, hearing about other people's encounters with evil and their survival, or the investigation that followed their deaths, helps her process her own trauma in ways that traditional therapy never could. This isn't unusual. Across the world, people who have experienced real horror often find solace in fictional horror, and researchers are beginning to understand why. It seems counterintuitive. Why would someone who's already experienced fear and pain seek out more of it? But the answer lies in understanding the difference between traumatic fear and chosen fear, between helplessness and agency, between chaos and narrative. When terrible things happen to us in real life, they often feel random, senseless, and uncontrollable. Trauma is characterized by a shattering of our sense of safety and predictability. The world stops feeling like a place where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. Instead, it reveals itself as a place where anything can happen to anyone at any time for no reason at all. Horror stories, paradoxically, can help restore a sense of order to this chaos. Even the scariest movie or book operates according to rules. There are protagonists and antagonists, causes and effects, beginnings and endings. The monster might be terrifying, but it has motivations, vulnerabilities, and limitations. Even when the hero doesn't survive, their death usually serves a purpose within the story's structure. For trauma survivors, engaging with fictional horror can be a way of practicing emotional responses to threatening situations, while maintaining complete control over the experience. If the story becomes too intense, they can stop reading or watching. They can skip ahead to see how it ends. They can read spoilers or reviews to know what's coming. This control is the opposite of what they experienced during their trauma, and exercising it can be profoundly healing. Dr. Matthias Clayson, who studies horror from an evolutionary psychology perspective, suggests that horror serves as a form of benign masochism that allows us to practice responding to threats in a safe environment. Just as children's play often involves practicing scenarios they might encounter as adults, playing house, playing war, playing doctor. Horror consumption lets adults practice emotional and psychological responses to extreme situations they hope never to encounter in reality. For people dealing with anxiety disorders, horror can serve a similar function. Anxiety is often characterized by vague, formless dread, a sense that something terrible is about to happen, but without knowing what or when or how to prepare for it. Horror stories provide specific threats with clear parameters. The monster appears at predictable moments, follows certain rules, and can be defeated through specific actions. Even when the protagonist fails, the failure has meaning within the story's context. Sarah, a 34-year-old teacher with generalized anxiety disorder, describes her relationship with horror this way. When I'm having a panic attack, my brain is telling me that everything is dangerous and I'm going to die, but I can't identify what the threat actually is. When I watch a horror movie, I get to experience that same physiological fear response, but there's a clear reason for it. The monster on screen is the threat, and when the movie ends, the threat ends. It's like exposure therapy for my anxiety. I get to practice feeling afraid and surviving it. This therapeutic aspect of horror has been formalized in some treatment settings. Researchers have found that carefully selected horror media can be used as part of treatment for specific phobias, PTSD, and anxiety disorders. The key is ensuring that the fictional fear remains controllable, and that it doesn't re-traumatize people who have already experienced real terror. There's also a social dimension to horror as healing. Horror communities, whether online forums, fan conventions, or simply groups of friends who watch scary movies together, provide spaces where people can share their darkest thoughts and fears without judgment. In a culture that often demands positivity and optimism, horror fandom creates permission to acknowledge that life can be frightening, painful, and unfair. These communities often develop deep bonds through shared vulnerability. When you've sat in a dark theater with strangers and felt your heart race in unison, when you've discussed your favorite fears with people who understand why you find comfort in darkness, you've participated in a form of collective processing that can be profoundly healing. For many horror fans, the genre provides a vocabulary for discussing difficult emotions and experiences. It's easier to talk about feeling haunted by a past relationship than to directly address the complex emotions involved. Describing depression as a monster that follows me around can be more accessible than clinical language. Horror metaphors allow people to communicate about painful experiences in ways that feel both accurate and manageable. The cathartic function of horror, the emotional release that comes from experiencing and surviving fictional fear, has been recognized since Aristotle wrote about tragedy's ability to purge audiences of pity and terror. Modern neuroscience helps us understand the mechanism. The stress hormones released during scary experiences are metabolized when the threat resolves, leaving behind a sense of relief and accomplishment. It's like emotional exercise. You work out your fear response in a controlled environment so it functions better when you really need it. For some people, horror serves as a form of exposure therapy for death anxiety. In a culture that often treats death as a taboo subject, horror stories provide one of the few socially acceptable venues for contemplating mortality. By repeatedly exposing ourselves to fictional death in controlled circumstances, we may become more psychologically prepared for the reality of our own mortality. Research suggests that people who regularly consume horror media show lower death anxiety than those who avoid such content. This doesn't mean they're cavalier about death, but rather that they've processed their fears about it more thoroughly. They've considered various ways they might die, imagined how they might respond to mortal threats, and survived thousands of fictional deaths through identification with characters. This exposure may make the reality of death feel less alien and terrifying. There's also evidence that horror can help people develop emotional resilience more generally. By regularly practicing intense emotional states in safe environments, horror fans may become better at regulating their emotions during real-life stress. They've learned that they can feel afraid and still function, that they can experience disgust and still think clearly, that they can witness terrible things and still maintain their moral compass. The ritual aspects of horror consumption also provide psychological benefits. Many horror fans develop elaborate rituals around their media consumption, specific times, places, or circumstances under which they engage with scary content. These rituals create a sense of control and containment around the experience, making it feel special and separate from everyday life. For some, the ritual might be watching horror movies alone on Friday nights, with all the lights off and a specific type of snack. For others, it might be reading horror novels on rainy Sunday afternoons, or listening to horror podcasts during evening walks. These rituals transform horror consumption from passive entertainment into active self-care, a way of deliberately creating and resolving tension in service of emotional regulation. The seasonal aspect of horror, its association with autumn, with Halloween, with the growing darkness of winter, taps into deep psychological needs around seasonal affective responses and the cyclical nature of death and renewal. By engaging with dark themes during dark seasons, we may be unconsciously preparing ourselves for the psychological challenges that come with reduced daylight and social isolation. This is perhaps the most beautiful paradox of horror. In seeking out what frightens us, we often discover what comforts us. In confronting our deepest fears in fictional form, we develop the emotional resources to face real challenges with greater courage and resilience. The monsters we invite into our imagination become, in a strange way, allies in our ongoing battle against the formless anxieties that threaten our peace of mind. In the liminal space between waking and sleeping, when your conscious mind begins to loosen its grip on reality, and your brain starts weaving the strange tapestries we call dreams, something fascinating happens to your relationship with fear. The same neurological processes that create nightmares also create the most effective horror stories, and the boundary between the two is far more porous than we might imagine. Your brain doesn't distinguish between real and imagined threats during REM sleep. When you're dreaming about being chased by a monster, your amygdala responds exactly as it would to a real monster. Your heart rate increases, stress hormones flood your system, and your body prepares for fight or flight, even though you're lying perfectly still in bed. This is why nightmares can wake you with your heart pounding and your body drenched in sweat, even though nothing actually happened. But here's where it gets interesting. The same mechanisms that create this authentic fear response in dreams also make horror stories feel real when we're awake. The most effective horror writers and filmmakers intuitively understand how the dreaming mind works, and they structure their stories to trigger the same responses that nightmares do. Think about the way nightmares unfold. They rarely make logical sense. You might find yourself in your childhood home, but the rooms are arranged wrong and there are doors that lead to nowhere. You're being chased, but you can never see exactly what's chasing you. You try to run, but your legs won't move properly. You try to scream, but no sound comes out. The rules of physics and causality that govern waking life are suspended, replaced by a dream logic that follows emotional rather than rational patterns. The best horror stories operate according to this same dream logic. They create scenarios that feel intensely real while you're experiencing them, but fall apart if you analyze them too rationally afterward. The house in a haunted house story is never just architecturally strange. It's psychologically wrong in ways that mirror how familiar spaces become threatening in nightmares. The monster is never fully visible or comprehensible, just like the shadowy pursuers in our anxiety dreams. Sleep paralysis, a phenomenon experienced by up to 8% of the population, provides a perfect example of how sleep and horror intersect. During sleep paralysis, your mind wakes up, but your body remains in the paralyzed state that normally prevents you from acting out your dreams. You're conscious but unable to move or speak, often while experiencing vivid, terrifying hallucinations. The hallucinations that accompany sleep paralysis are remarkably consistent across cultures and throughout history. People report seeing shadowy figures standing in their rooms, feeling crushing weights on their chests, sensing malevolent presences watching them, or experiencing the sensation of being touched or grabbed by invisible hands. These experiences are so universal that almost every culture has developed folklore to explain them. The old hag of Anglo-Saxon folklore, the pinyin of China, the Carabasan of Turkey, the sea yucat of Cambodia. All of these supernatural explanations for sleep paralysis share common elements that directly influence how we construct horror stories. The sense of being watched by something malevolent, the feeling of being physically restrained by an unseen force, the presence of something ancient and alien in familiar spaces. These are the building blocks of effective horror. But sleep doesn't only give us nightmares. It also gives us the psychological tools to process and integrate fearful experiences. During REM sleep, your brain consolidates memories and works through emotional experiences from your waking hours. If you've watched a horror movie or read a scary story during the day, your dreaming mind will often continue processing that experience, sometimes transforming it into something less threatening or finding ways to integrate it into your existing psychological framework. This is why many horror fans report that they rarely have nightmares about the scary media they consume. Their brains have learned to categorize fictional horror as safe fear that doesn't require the same type of processing as real threats. Instead of creating anxiety dreams, their sleeping minds might transform horror elements into more neutral or even positive dream content. Lucid dreaming, the ability to become conscious that you're dreaming while still remaining in the dream state, offers particularly interesting insights into the relationship between horror and sleep. Lucid dreamers often report that they can transform nightmares into more positive experiences by recognizing that they're dreaming and taking control of the dream narrative. This ability to recognize and manipulate dream content, while it's happening, parallels the way that horror media allows us to experience fear while maintaining awareness that we're safe. Just as a lucid dreamer can face down a dream monster by remembering that it's not real, a horror fan can enjoy being scared by a movie while maintaining awareness that they're watching actors on a screen. The hypnagogic state, that drowsy period between waking and sleeping, is where some of the most interesting intersections between horror and sleep occur. During this transitional state, your brain begins to produce the kind of random, associative thinking that characterizes dreams, but you're still conscious enough to observe and sometimes direct the process. Many horror writers and artists report that their best ideas come during these twilight moments of consciousness. The rational, critical mind that might dismiss a scary idea as silly or impossible is temporarily offline, allowing more primitive, emotional responses to surface. In this state, the impossible feels possible, the irrational feels reasonable, and fears that might seem manageable during full consciousness can feel overwhelmingly real. Stephen King has written extensively about the hypnagogic state as a source of horror inspiration. He describes lying in bed in that half-asleep state and allowing his mind to wander into dark territories, following the strange logic of pre-dream thinking until it leads him to genuinely frightening scenarios. Many of his most famous stories allegedly originated during these moments of transitional consciousness. The relationship between horror and sleep also extends to the way that scary stories affect our sleep patterns. While you might expect that consuming horror content before bed would lead to nightmares and disrupted sleep, research suggests that the relationship is more complex. For regular horror consumers, scary media often serves as a form of sleep aid, providing just enough stimulation to occupy anxious minds while they drift off to sleep. This might seem counterintuitive, but it makes sense when you consider that many people's biggest sleep obstacle is an overactive mind that won't quiet down. Racing thoughts about work, relationships, or future worries can keep people awake for hours. Horror content provides an alternative focus. Instead of worrying about real problems that have no clear solutions, the mind can engage with fictional problems that do have clear parameters and resolutions. The rhythmic, repetitive nature of many horror narratives also supports sleep induction. Ghost stories, in particular, often follow predictable patterns. The initial manifestation, the escalating activity, the investigation of the haunting source, and the final resolution or acceptance. This narrative structure provides a kind of mental lullaby, guiding the listener or reader through a familiar emotional journey that ends in resolution. Professional storytellers have long understood this connection. Traditional bedtime stories often contain mildly frightening elements. The wolf in Little Red Riding Hood, the witch in Hansel and Gretel, the giant in Jack and the Beanstalk. Because these small doses of controllable fear help children process their daily anxieties while preparing for sleep. The stories provide a safe space to encounter and overcome threats, building psychological resilience while inducing relaxation. The audio format of horror stories, whether podcasts, audiobooks, or spoken tales like this one, creates particularly strong connections to the sleep experience. The human voice in darkness has been humanity's primary method of sharing fears and finding comfort since our earliest days. When you listen to someone tell a scary story in a soothing voice, you're participating in one of our species' oldest rituals. The narrator's voice becomes a guide through dark territories, a trusted companion who promises to bring you safely back to the light. This relationship between storyteller and listener mirrors the relationship between conscious and unconscious mind during the process of falling asleep. The conscious mind gradually relinquishes control, trusting that the unconscious will take over and provide the rest and processing that sleep makes possible. Sleep research has revealed that the brain doesn't simply shut down during sleep. It engages in active processes of memory consolidation, emotional processing, and psychological integration. The fears you encounter in horror stories during the day may be processed and integrated during sleep, transformed from immediate emotional experiences into long-term memories that can inform future responses to real threats. This processing can actually make people more resilient and better prepared for genuine challenges. By experiencing and surviving fictional fears during waking hours, and then processing those experiences during sleep, we build a library of emotional responses and coping strategies that can be accessed during real crises. The circular relationship between dreams and horror creates a feedback loop that enriches both experiences. Nightmares provide raw material for horror creators, while horror stories influence the content and structure of dreams. The best horror taps into universal dream experiences. The feeling of being chased, the sensation of falling, the terror of losing control, the fear of being watched by something unseen. As the boundaries between sleeping and waking consciousness become increasingly permeable in our always connected world, the relationship between horror and sleep becomes even more relevant. The blue light from screens disrupts natural sleep cycles, while the constant stream of information and stimulation makes it harder for minds to quiet down naturally. In this context, horror stories that acknowledge and work with our natural sleep processes become even more valuable as tools for mental health and emotional regulation. The monsters that visit us in nightmares and the monsters we invite into our waking imagination serve similar psychological functions. They provide safe spaces to encounter and practice responses to our deepest fears. They allow us to experience intense emotions in controlled circumstances. They remind us that we're capable of surviving frightening experiences and emerging stronger on the other side. But perhaps most importantly, both nightmares and horror stories remind us that the darkness is temporary. No matter how frightening the dream, we always wake up. No matter how scary the story, it always ends. In a world filled with genuine uncertainties and real threats, this promise of resolution, this assurance that every dark night is followed by dawn, may be the most comforting aspect of our relationship with fictional fear. Tonight, we've journeyed together through the shadows of human imagination, from the cave paintings of our earliest ancestors to the digital nightmares of our connected age. We've explored the ancient roots of fear carved into our very DNA, wandered through Gothic mansions where literature learned to make beauty from terror, and discovered how each generation creates the monsters it needs to understand its particular moment in history. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the beautiful darkness that lives within us all. If you're already drifting off to sleep, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may your dreams be filled with adventures that strengthen you, monsters that teach you, and the absolute certainty that no matter how dark the night becomes, you carry within yourself all the light you'll ever need to find your way home.